Hello, I'm Dr. Hope Ferdowsian, President and Chief Executive of Phoenix Zones Initiative. Thank you for your interest in learning about how to help refugees and asylum seekers. I'd like to start with a brief story about someone I refer to as Doc in my book Phoenix Zones. Doc is a physician from Iran. He was arrested after he spoke out on behalf of his colleagues who were being targeted and tortured by government officials. After Doc was arrested, he too was tortured. He suffered numerous injuries, and after he was released from prison, he was forced to flee so he would not be killed. He fled to the U.S., where he applied for asylum. I met Doc when I was asked to conduct a forensic medical evaluation of him. Documented, objective evidence of torture helped bolster his asylum claim. Stay tuned to find out if Doc was granted asylum and how he's doing today. Doc isn't alone. Worldwide conflict, violence, and persecution have driven up internal and external displacement. If forced to return to their nations of origin, many people will face injury or death. There are now more than 80 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. Most of them are internally displaced within their countries of origin. In 2020, 26 million displaced people qualified as refugees, and 4.2 million were asylum seekers. Most people were from places plagued by conflict and war, economically and environmentally impoverished conditions, and human rights violations. As these people are forced to migrate from their homes, they encounter a range of physical and mental health challenges, including separation from their friends and families, unpredictable or inadequate access to food and water, numerous types of injuries, infectious diseases, physical and sexual assault, and other forms of trauma. Before we go further, it's important to define who qualifies as a migrant, a refugee, or an asylum seeker. The term migrant is quite broad, and it's been used in a number of ways. Migration is a necessary part of life, but it isn't always voluntary. Sometimes it is forced. A refugee is any person outside their country of nationality who is unable or unwilling to return because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution on account of their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Doc was targeted because of his political opinion, among other reasons. Some people do not have a nationality to claim, and they are considered stateless. Some people are born stateless, and others become stateless. Regardless, stateless individuals and families can still qualify as refugees. Refugees have a right to international protection. An asylum seeker is a person who has left their country and is seeking protection from persecution, but who hasn't yet legally been recognized as a refugee. They must make a legal claim for asylum, as Doc did. Asylum is also considered an international human right. The Attorney General of the U.S. and their designees may grant asylum if it is determined that the individual is a refugee within the meaning of established law. Asylum law emerged from human rights treaties created after the Second World War, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was championed by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. According to case law, types of harm that can count as persecution include extreme physical and emotional harm to the asylum applicant and their family, detention with physical assault or torture, harm, death, or the disappearance of family members, prolonged detention and interrogation, rape, and female genital cutting or mutilation. These forms of persecution can leave physical and mental scars, and as a result, physicians and other health professionals can play a critical role in the objective documentation of medical and psychiatric evidence of torture, ill treatment, or other forms of abuse and persecution in asylum seekers, as I did with Doc's case. In order to understand some of the health-related challenges asylum seekers and refugees face, it's important to understand the process they must go through to settle in a new country. Refugees go through the refugee resettlement process, which is typically a multi-year process that involves the U.S. State Department, UNHCR, which is the United Nations Refugee Agency, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and a resettlement agency such as the International Rescue Committee. It's a very long and difficult process, and worldwide only about 1% of refugees are resettled. Asylum seekers may apply through an affirmative or a defensive process. To apply affirmatively, someone may enter the U.S. on a valid visa and then apply for asylum. Typically, to qualify for affirmative asylum, applicants must apply within 1 year of arrival in the U.S. Alternatively, asylum seekers may arrive at the border or a port of entry and request asylum there. These people are detained and they may be forced to stay in a detention center, which is basically a prison. If they are able to establish a credible fear of persecution, they will receive a hearing before an immigration judge. If they are denied at either stage, they will be deported unless they appeal. If their appeal is unsuccessful, they will be deported. Defensive asylum proceedings occur when someone fleeing persecution does not request asylum at the border or if they overstay a valid visa. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, then becomes involved, and the asylum seeker can then apply for asylum and appear before an immigration judge. The situation for refugees and asylum seekers changed significantly between 2017 and 2021. For the first time in decades, beginning in 2017, the U.S. began to trail the rest of the world in refugee resettlement. The number of refugees allowed to enter the U.S. was capped at 15,000 people through the end of the fiscal year in September 2021. Likewise, while the number of asylum seekers rose between 2016 and 2018, the percentage of denied claims rose disproportionately. These trends can be linked to global conflict and to changes in policy. For example, there were efforts to increase the number of deportations at the U.S.-Mexico border, which effectively decreased the number of people who would be granted asylum. So-called deterrence policies, like family separation and lower caps on the refugee resettlement program, also reduced the numbers of refugees and asylum seekers who could safely enter the U.S. There are many direct and indirect health consequences of these policies and practices, which have compounded the mental and physical health challenges that refugees and asylum seekers already face. In 2020, it was reported that 6 children died in Border Patrol care. According to reports from ProPublica, 3 children died from flu-related complications, 1 died of sepsis, and 2 died from chronic conditions they had before crossing the border. Children also suffered sexual abuse while in the custody of the federal government, as was widely reported. Adults also face physical and mental health threats while in federal custody. The detention of asylum seekers is known to cause a range of mental health effects, including PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, and depression. Beginning in 2020, detained asylum seekers were also exposed to an increased risk for COVID due to the crowded conditions in detention centers. People who were deported also faced the risk of abuse or being killed. In 2020, The Guardian reported on a Human Rights Watch study showing that hundreds of Salvadorans were killed, sexually assaulted, or abused in other ways after they were deported from the U.S. Similar patterns have also emerged as a result of the so-called Remain in Mexico program. This policy allowed U.S. border officers to return non-Mexican asylum seekers to unsafe locations in Mexico as their claims are adjudicated in U.S. immigration courts, mostly without the benefit of legal assistance. Tens of thousands of asylum seekers, including very young children, were sent to wait in Mexico. Beginning in 2021, the Biden administration started taking steps to reverse this policy. Finally, it's worth noting that the challenges asylum seekers face did not merely emerge in the Trump administration. For decades, unaccompanied minors have been detained in federal custody, and a long-term anthropological project led by Jason De Leon and the Undocumented Migration Project has shown how so-called prevention through deterrence policies have resulted in unimaginable suffering and death at or north of the southern border. There are also indirect health effects. People may be afraid to access education, a social determinant of health, the justice system, another potential determinant of health, medical care, and other basic needs. These issues complicate the medical and mental health issues that refugees and asylum seekers already face, including malnutrition, the effects of exposure to extreme heat or cold, and physical or mental injuries as a result of torture or ill treatment that they faced in their countries of origin or while in transit. So, why would someone leave everything behind to make such an arduous journey? Here are some of the reasons that asylum seekers have shared with me over the years. One woman told me about a partner she was trying to escape in order to protect her children. She said, "I learned to stay quiet and avoid him. Then he began abusing my children. The police refused to take an official report." One gay man fleeing persecution told me that he and his partner experienced the following at their home. "The mob began kicking us, beating us with their fists, and whipping us with belts. At one point, it looked like nearly 100 people. I thought that we were going to be killed." One woman shared with me that the man she had been forced to marry told her he could do anything he wanted to me, that he owned me. So, what can you do to help refugees and asylum seekers, particularly as more and more refugees and asylum seekers must also struggle with stigmatization, discrimination, and hate crimes? One of the most important things you can do is be an upstander and to advocate for a compassionate and just immigration system. You can learn more about how to do that on Phoenix Zone's Initiative's website. Another way you can help refugees and asylum seekers is to be aware of medical and other resources that are available to them, including Medicaid in the exchange for documented immigrants, emergency Medicaid services for undocumented immigrants and some others, nutrition programs, especially for documented and undocumented children, and local hospital and outpatient charity care and community health centers, which also offer healthcare services for some refugees and asylum seekers at no cost or a reduced cost. Those of you who are clinicians can also provide trauma-informed medical and mental health care that's respectful, compassionate, and just. It's also useful to be aware of national and local legal and social services that refugees and asylum seekers can benefit from. For those of you who are researchers, there are many policy-related research questions that can and need to be addressed. And students, residents, physicians, and other health professionals can also participate in forensic medical and psychiatric evaluations of asylum seekers, as I mentioned earlier. It's a great way to make a difference in the life of an asylum seeker, and you can even save a life. One study showed that 89% of asylum seekers who had undergone a forensic clinical evaluation were granted asylum, in contrast with a national average of 38% of asylum seekers at the time. Having documented objective evidence of torture makes a difference. And I'm happy to talk or work with you if you're interested in establishing an asylum medicine clinic in your community. You could fill a real need. Now is a good time to tell you more about Doc. After several years and many challenges, Doc was granted asylum in the U.S. He became an active member in his local medical community, and he was reunited with his family. He's also become a friend. His challenges have not ended, but like so many other asylum seekers, his resolve is inspirational. Working with asylum seekers has deepened my understanding of and gratitude for freedom, and it has helped me understand how resilience is possible. We've covered a lot of ground in a relatively short amount of time. If you're interested in learning more, there are many resources available. Here are just a couple. The Society for Asylum Medicine, which my colleagues, Drs. Kate McKenzie, Amy Zedin, Sean Sidhu, and I co-founded, is available at asylummedicine.com to those who are interested and doing relevant work. And at Phoenix Zone's Initiative, we have an effective advocacy toolkit, which you can access for free in the Resource Center. You can learn more about how to effectively advocate for others, including how to write to and meet with your public representatives, how to write opinion editorials, and how to effectively mobilize with other people to advocate for important causes. Finally, I'd leave you with the following quote from Chief Sealth of the Duwanish tribe in the state of Washington. In the 1800s, he wrote a letter to President Franklin Pierce after receiving a request to sell land to the U.S. government. He said, "How can you buy or sell the sky? the warmth of the land. The idea is strange to us, yet we do not own the freshness of the air or the sparkle of the water. How can you buy them from us? Every part of this earth is sacred to my people. Every shining pine needle, every sandy shore, every mist in the dark woods, every clearing and humming insect is holy in the memory and experience of my people. As the conversation about borders changes, it's worth remembering Chief Self's wise words. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk with you, and if you have questions, please feel free to reach out.